Let me read you a little bit of Baba's first chapter on the man-God. Most of this material, one way or another, you've been over, but it's good to review it. He says that even before God realization, the advanced aspirants pass through states of consciousness, which in some ways are akin to the state of God realization. For example, the musts and saints of the higher planes are completely desireless and immersed in the joy of God intoxication. This is when you get up to about the fifth plane, that desires drop out from the individual, and the individual begins to see God and to have certain real internal experiences. And then he goes on and talks about various individuals who are having experiences of the planes and begin to hear sounds. If you've never, well, don't let me put it that way, there is such a thing that one calls the celestial music, the music of the spheres. There are certain experiences of odor and certain experiences of color and sight and of harmonies that one begins to have on the planes, and one begins to be able to do certain types of concentrations and laying on of hands. And these things are rather exciting to the individual. So Baba says about them, the field of their powers is itself a domain of illusion, and the miracles which they perform do not necessarily mean that they're in any way nearer to the God state. You notice so many times Baba never brings up the subject of, let's say, the so-called miraculous powers without cautioning the individual who is going on the path not to associate this with the degree of God realization, the degree of progress on the path of the individual. He says, after all, if you really stop to think for a moment, suppose that an individual points his finger at that dry tree over there and all of a sudden it bursts out into flowers. Maybe the individual is a Guru Nanak. Maybe the individual is a seventh plane master. But perhaps the individual isn't at all. This is simply dealing with illusion within illusion, after all. This is not a sign of God realization. I wonder how Baba ever put up with all of these stories that we bothered him with all of his lifetime to try to impress upon him how far we had gone along the spiritual path by these miraculous little things that would come along. I mean, and poor old Baba, he would just sort of look bored. Yes, Mike?
How does one know how advanced one's guru is?
You can, for instance, identify certain characteristics with certain stages of the path.
Say you've got a guide or a master that you're thinking about. How do you associate him with the planes?
You probably won't. There's probably no way that you can do it. An individual may be able to associate what he has done. If I told you, for instance, of certain experiences that I'd had in life, that this was the way I tried to impress you, you might be able to divine from this. If I told you about how lovely it was to hear the celestial music, you would probably say, well, he's at least on the first or the second plane then. And then if I told you about, let's say, the time that I stopped the railroad train in mid-tracks and the time that I raised the corpse from the dead, you would probably say, well, yeah, Don's got to be, I guess, about the fourth plane at that point. And then, on the other hand, if I impressed upon you the fact that I had absolutely not a desire under the sun and had a great deal of internal bliss, probably you would say, well, he has to be about a fifth plane master. So you could draw certain rough conclusions if I told you stories about myself and my experiences, you see.
What's the relevance of them?
Simply that one has done that amount of wearing out of samskaras. One has gotten to that degree of internal freedom, and therefore that much closer to the reality within oneself. There's no reason to talk about them as a matter of fact with another person. Baba, don't misunderstand me on one point though. Baba outlines clean-cut and clearly creation, right from the surging of God's whim to know himself consciously. He outlines the thing right straight on back up to God realization. And he does this, at least I feel, for one very, very specific purpose, and that is to give a questing, an honestly questing individual, such a complete sense of the function and the purpose of the universe, the individual will never be able to question it. He says to himself, by God, that makes sense. I know instinctively this man knows what he's talking about, and I'm going to start chugging along that particular path. But he's got the whole path to do. but by giving a clean-cut, let's say, blueprint of what creation is. It doesn't help the individual to move along the path, but it helps him to say, all right, this makes sense, and I'm going to put my shoulder to the wheel.
Let's say someone's robbed a bank or does an awful bad thing. You couldn't say he's on the path or off the path?
It means absolutely nothing. And the fact that, let's say, he points his finger at the tree and it bursts forth into leaf, you can't say that that individual is on the path or off of the path or high up the path or low on the path. Because quite frankly, there are ways that you can work on concentrative activity so that you can produce these results. But the reason that Baba keeps bringing this up, the reason that I keep emphasizing it is instinctively, unconsciously, despite yourself, you'll automatically associate spiritual progress with the miraculous. And if there is one thing that Baba tries to chop its head off again and again in order to keep the individual moving ahead healthily, is to point out that this is dealing with illusion within illusion. Believe me, Michael, my generation sat around and spent so much time and fuss and huffed and puffed and so misassociated spiritual development with the development of these sort of powers that it was absolutely asinine. But Baba's a hoarder. He's greedy. He's greedy for one thing, that the individual shall put every bit of effort and sincerity that he has got into the effective pursuit of the path and of the goal, and not get into these sidetrack whirlpools. And one of the chiefest whirlpools that an individual can get involved in is phenomenalism associated with spirituality and the working of wonders and miracles. Believe me, this is the easiest way for an individual to get himself stuck for a whole lifetime or even lifetimes. They're so fascinating, they are so unusual that one unconsciously associates them with spirituality. And one cannot afford to. So anytime that somebody comes around and starts telling you choice little stories, if it's a fun story, and you just leave it like that, just as you would tell a joke about Ike and Mike or something of that sort, you know. I guess they're sort of passé now, though, aren't they? But at any rate, if you tell it just as a fun story and forget it just as a fun story, and you never think about it having anything to do with spirituality, fine. But otherwise, when you hear people talking about this individual who's had these experiences and this individual who has developed these powers, all right, just immediately say to yourself, these are individuals who are probably hopelessly enmeshed in phenomenality within creation. And they will probably spend all of their lifetime not budging one single millimeter on the spiritual path. From the standpoint of consciousness also, aspirants belong to various types according to the line in which they have advanced and according to their nearness to the God state. Some get intoxicated with their extraordinary powers and tempted to use them, have a long pause in their Godward march. They get stuck in the consciousness of the intermediate planes. This is it. Some get intoxicated with their extraordinary powers, you see, and they're tempted to use them, and they associate this with spirituality. Believe you me, if you have never seen an individual who has developed the capability of using certain mystic powers, you don't realize how stuck an individual can get. And they think they are making superb, magnificent progress. And all that they're doing is to work on this little phase, arguing with themselves about that little aspect. And they go around and around and around, concentrating on refinements within one little tiny aspect that is going nowhere at all. And to them, it seems exciting and tremendous. They get stuck in the consciousness of the intermediate planes. Some become dazed, confused, and even self-deluded. Some are caught in a coma. There are some who, with difficulty, try to come down to gross consciousness by repeating some physical action or by repeating a sentence many times. This is the sort of thing that Baba did, as you recall, when he went back to his room after Baba Jan had kissed him on the forehead, banging his head on the stone, not just because of pain, the painfulness of creation about him, but also simply trying to refocus on this. Try to come down to gross consciousness by repeating some physical action or by repeating a sentence many times. You've seen an individual who's been dazed by an emotional crisis in their life, just repeating and repeating and repeating something, because it's their grip on reality for that moment. It's the stone that they're beating their forehead on to try to retain consciousness, to retain conscious contact around them. There are some who, in their God intoxication, are so indifferent to the life of the gross world that to all appearances their external behavior is like that of mad persons. And there are some who tread the path while performing their worldly duties. This is what Baba has said is necessary in our Western culture, to develop a tradition of mysticism in which the individual can go along the path while performing his worldly duties. This is the sort of thing, for instance, that we do in this type of a group activity. And this is one of the reasons that Baba himself, so often in his writings, his discourses, constantly hammers on this theme of doing it within the context of the daily world. This is what is thrust upon us by our times. This is the path which we almost inevitably have to follow.
Part 2, Qualifications of the Aspirant.
Qualifications of the aspirant, entering into the realities of inner life. Though God realization is the ultimate destiny of all persons, there are very few who have the necessary preparation for the early fulfillment of that glorious destiny. The mind of the worldly minded is darkened by a thick layer of accumulated sanskaras, which must be considerably weakened for the aspirant even to enter the path. The usual method for gradually dissipating the load of sanskaras is to follow as strictly as possible the external code of religious rituals and ceremonies. And so Baba is laying out, as he so very often does, the ultimate truth. He says, just very simply, again reminding us that God realization is what each individual is going to come to. Sooner or later it's there. On the other hand, he says, if you look around statistically amongst your neighbors and all of the people in the city and the country, there are very few who actually have the necessary preparation to get off the launching pad on this. And he says the reason that it isn't is simply because there are these things that he traditionally calls sanskaras, and which I always remind you, what Baba calls a sanskara is a habit pattern that the individual has developed. Many of them tremendously primitive habit patterns that come straight up through the evolutionary development of the soul. And all of these various different habit patterns are what cause the individual to be convinced, I am I, this is what I've got to have, this is what I hate, this is what I love, these are what my rights are, I am separate, you are separate, we're fighting each other. So the reason that there are very few people statistically anywhere at any one point, at any one period of time, is simply because of the fact that an individual identifies with what he thinks he is as an individual. Sounds almost stupid, doesn't it? After all, each person in this room, when he sits back and says, well, Stevens, you just gave a perfect description of me. I'm sure this is where we are. But Baba says that it is our sense of identifying as a separate human being with all of our likes and dislikes and the pushes and pulls, which we just take for granted. And when somebody tries to oppose him, we fight like hell. We assume he's wrong, trying to deprive us of our rights. This is the reason that so few people are ready for the spiritual path. So then you may say, well, in that case, I don't know that I want to be ready for the spiritual path. Because, of course, I know the things that I want, and of course, they're right, and I'm going to go on fighting for them. And so Baba says, okay, all right, sure, this is the reason people aren't ready for the spiritual path. But then, in the next sentence, and I'll anticipate, he goes on and starts putting a little bit of the handwriting on the wall that it does gradually happen as an individual goes through lifetimes of experience, that this event, that event, this sourpuss father, horrible boss, the absolute unapproachability of that magnificent, beautiful girl that you want to marry, and all of these sorts of things that happen over a course of a lifetime and lifetimes, and that bring an individual up to a sudden shock and force him to do just a little bit of thinking and feeling, gradually begin to untie a little bit, to loosen the knot of our identification with our own identity and likes and dislikes. And when an individual gets to a certain degree of looseness, so he's no longer quite as dead certain that that's what he absolutely has to have, or absolutely has to be, or absolutely has to own, when he begins to be just a little bit tiny loosened, and every once in a while says, maybe just a little bit to himself, I'm not sure. It's about then that an individual has enough degree of freedom of motion to begin to be able to do something about the spiritual path. He no longer is just dead, 100% automatically certain of who he is, what he needs, and what it's all about. And at that particular point, something can begin to happen. Baba says in another discourse, in another one of the volumes, that it is not until the individual is motivated by the energy of desperation that he is finally ready to go on the spiritual path. He makes no bones about it. He simply says that for the individual to go ahead internally, really to go ahead internally, it takes tremendous energy and tremendous commitment, to use one of Bob's words. And that this can't happen through an individual being just a little disappointed or a little bit looking or a little bit curious philosophically. This doesn't happen until an individual at some point in life has come up against such a tremendous, abrupt, shocking, startling stone wall in relation to a major desire in his life that he's got to settle back and say, God, what's the whole thing all about? Then Baba says there is the motivation there for the individual. There is the energy, the raw energy available there at that time. But you might say to me, Elvin Stevens, I have a friend who, when he first ran across Yoga Maharshi, as soon as he ran across Maharshi, he immediately knew who Maharshi was. And from that point on, well, he just went right straight along in a life of deep commitment to Maharshi. Don't mix him up with Maharishi, incidentally. Maharshi is dead these days. A very, very great individual in India. So at any rate, you say, oh, what about this individual? I don't know of any great, fantastic disappointment in his life, and yet he went right along. How's he fit in with what Baba says? Well, there's a lovely little trapdoor out back there, because you remember, Baba says there is such a thing as reincarnation. He doesn't say that for you to go ahead in this lifetime you had to have had a great disappointment. But the thing that started you at some point in the succession of incarnations was a tremendous shock which gave you the energy, which sits there before it just poured out in that direction. But all of a sudden it was blocked off. There it is. It acts under pressure, and it really starts to look for what is it? What's going on? What is reason? And that might have happened in a previous lifetime to this individual who suddenly saw Maharshi. And this just automatically opened out the way to where he had been at the end of his previous lifetime. So it is not necessary that the individual have this shattering experience of disappointment in this particular lifetime. So let's go on with the other sentence here in this particular paragraph. He says, the usual method for gradually dissipating the load of samskaras is to follow as strictly as possible the external code of religious rituals and ceremonies. Now, I know this raises the hackles on most people's head, especially nowadays, because you say, well, I always thought that from what little I knew of Baba that he was quite an enlightened and an unusual and a real individual. And yet he's talking about the necessity of going through religious rituals and ceremonies. How about it? How come? And it is a rather shocking statement to make. But he goes on and explains a little bit. He says the stage of external conformity is useful in its own way as a spiritual discipline. This is sort of like kindergarten to the individual ongoing soul. And believe me, you can't skip it. If you find that you're all upset with a religious ritual and ceremony, it probably means you've been through kindergarten. You don't need it. But he puts it in here for one real purpose, and that is, for heaven's sake, if somebody else is deeply involved in religious ritual and ceremony, and if this is satisfactory and fulfilling to them, don't sit down and tell them that they're leading a superficial life and doing things in a superficial fashion. No, let him go through this preliminary process which is necessary. Don't look down your nose. Don't try to get them out of it. Simply wish them well and wish them all Godspeed at this particular phase. But he says then, going on about this, because he just gives one little brief mention. All right, this is the first stage, and it does a certain amount of disciplining. Now, mind you, Baba doesn't steer clear of this question of disciplining at all. It's gotten to be sort of an old-fashioned and an unhappy word for most people. But there is such a thing as discipline, and it fulfills a tremendous function, but that's not for this evening. And then he goes on and says, however, about the stage of external conformity, but it is by no means free from evil effects, for it not only tends to make a man dry, rigid, and mechanical, but it often nourishes some kind of subtle egotism. Now, this is where you all nod your head, because this is the part which you all agree with and which causes most of you not to want to have anything to do with it and to hate the guts of many people who do have something to do with it, because it does tend to make them dry, rigid, and mechanical, and because you know as well as I do that many of the people who conform most rigidly to external standards of religion are very often some of the most egotistical individuals that you encounter in your life. Baba says, yes, it nourishes that. But still, don't overlook the fact that the original function of ritual and ceremony is a type of a disciplining, and it does something to the individual to start a little tiny bit of a prying on those knots of identification with your own desire patterns. Then he goes on over in another part here, and he says, like the insect which passes on through metamorphosis to the next stage of existence, the soul transcends the phase of external conformity. Finally get rid of it. You've worn it out. You've digested it. It no longer has any appeal nor any good for you. And enters upon the path of spiritual emancipation. So this is the next part. And this is where the question of aspirants and aspiration comes in. In this higher phase, the soul is no longer satisfied. You get right down to what really satisfies the individual. This is the important thing. You don't create inside of yourself by wanting it a desire for this or for that. You cotton to what is natural to you. If it is natural and it's the right stage, you cotton to external conformity and religious ceremony. And that's all right. And as long as that is desirable and it satisfies you, you stick with it because it's doing a very necessary process. And you let the other guy stick with it if he's satisfied. Then, however, he says, at some point or another, it is no longer satisfying. It just doesn't fill the bill. And then, this is the time for the individual to go on. In this higher phase, the soul is no longer satisfied by external conformity with certain rules, but wants to acquire those qualifications, which would make the inner life spiritually beautiful. One begins to be dissatisfied. One wants something more, deeper, more satisfying in life. One searches for value. Very often, as a matter of fact, an individual at this particular point will begin to blame. You can easily sidetrack at this particular point. It's terribly easy. Terribly easy. An individual becomes dissatisfied with the old form, rituals, conventions. He has a longing. He doesn't quite know what he's longing for. And he can terribly easily at this point then begin to blame, let's say, the organized structure of society for his own discontent. You will find individuals who are searching, but who become bitter and blame the external structure of society, of relatedness, for their inability to be satisfied and to find what they need at that point. You can help them by suggesting to them that it is not the fault of society and of its structuring, but what one has to do is to plunge deeper internally. You can have tremendous numbers of very sincere, very honest people sidetracked for a whole lifetime at a critical juncture because they tend so much to imagine that the problem of their own dissatisfaction is related to the faults of society. Now, by this, I don't mean that society doesn't have faults. Don't read me wrong. But what that individual is looking for is nothing that is ever going to be answered in society, not even in the most ideal society. He has to go deep inside of himself and plunge deep.
Don, do you mean only society at large, or could it be family also?
Family also, sure. So terribly easily. One can say, my family isn't structured right. Or it's my father's fault, or it's my brother's fault, and so on. So one has to go deep inside of himself to find the thing that one is looking for. It won't be answered within structure. It won't be answered within an attitude. Sometimes people stick. Well, then Baba says at this particular point the individual kicks over convention. Perfectly all right. But then he goes on and picks up some of the dangers that's involved at this particular point when one starts kicking over conventionality. And this is extraordinarily important. The beauty with which Baba steers an individual quickly and deftly between this sort of a rock that you can pile up your ship for a hell of a long time on, this rock over here. He takes one so subtly. You can sit down and feel through and read through a discourse of this sort so many, many, many times and get such extraordinary insight into what comes not right in as a religious man. He's talking about real life, the things that John Horter and Craig and Bob and Don and Cindy wrestle with day by day. But he gives one a crystal clear X-ray outline of what's going on. Well, he's taking up one of the chief things that an individual has to feel and think carefully about when he gets into the stage of kicking over pure conventionality. Here we have an individual who kicked it over, and he started adopting a great many unconventional approaches. Right? This is where most of us sitting here are. We're talking about it now. Sometimes people stick to unconventional things for no other reason that they're out of the ordinary. And he's not being moral here. He's bringing this up for a very, very important thing. What Bob is doing all of the time is standing out there on the sidelines and cheering on the race horses going around. This particular thing that he wants an individual to get to the place he's got to get to, which is God's realization, which is reality. So, he says, first of all, conventionality and conventional religion fulfills a certain function. Then the individual becomes dissatisfied with it because it fulfills that need. So then he starts looking at some of the more unconventional things. But it's terribly easy for the pendulum to swing way over here, so he becomes hip on unconventionality. So that anyway, it's terribly easy to swing it completely over to the other side, and so that nothing has any connotation of value unless it's unconventional. And whenever one is approached by anything in the environment that belongs to the old conventional school, one says, that old tripe, it belongs to an outmoded generation. But listen to what Bob is saying here, because this is important to the sake of reality. The unusual nature of their pursuit or interest enables them to feel their separateness and difference from others and to take delight in it. Well, here's a guy who's no better off than the terribly conventional guy. The terribly conventional guy wanted to be buried in the mob and have absolutely no sense of ever having left his mother's womb, if you'll excuse me for being Freudian. And here you've got an individual over here who is so obsessed in doing everything different and adopting unusual things just so he will feel different from everybody else. And he's skipped, just as skipped, in a different direction. Unconventional things, and he is just as bound, and this is the point, he is just as bound. Unconventional things often generate interest merely through their novelty, in contrast with conventional things. And here you have sort of an artistic attitude towards the thing. The illusory values of usual things become insipid through familiarity. And you get tired of them. You get tired of seeing that same globe all of the time. You get tired of seeing Stephen dressed up in a businessman suit with a tie on. One day I'll wear something different. You get tired of seeing, let's say, rugs on floors, and you say, why can't we have straw matting or something of that sort? Let's do things different. Tired, fed up with it. And why not? He's not arguing against this. So the illusory values of usual things become insipid through familiarity, and the mind then has a tendency to transfer the illusion of value to those things which are not usual instead of trying to discover true and lasting values. This is what happens to the individual. You're tired of the familiar things, and so you transfer the sense of value to the unusual. But does this mean that there's any value in the unusual? Not because it's unusual, but this is the almost fatal mistake that an individual tends to drift into, of assuming that the unusual does have value. Transcending the stage of external conformity does not imply a merely mechanical and thoughtless change from conventionality to unconventionality. Bob is just warning the individual about not being hit upon sheer unconventionality for the sake of unconventionality. because that's got just as big a booby trap as the individual who is conventionally religious has a Philip to his own egotism. It's just as stuck if you're stuck in unconventionality for the sake of misplaced value or your own egotism as a conventionally religious person. This is the beauty of Baba. He shows how it is equally possible to be stuck on both sides of the spectrum here. And one has to be honest about this. And so it goes on. He talks some more about unconventionality and discriminating. What one really needs to do is to discriminate between the true and the false. So this is what the individual is out after. One isn't out after conventionality or unconventionality. For heaven's sake, get all of that tripe and hogwash behind one. What you're really on the search for, if you've got an ounce of honesty inside of you, is what's the truth. Right? Maybe the truth is long hair. Maybe the truth is short hair. Maybe the truth is dirty jeans. Maybe the truth is a slim businessman's suit. I don't know what the truth is, but you get out and you try to find the real truth in the process. So then, on over into another section here. For the spiritual aspirant, however, it is not enough to exercise, saying, all right, we're searching for the truth, so you start to try to become discriminating. This is the key, discriminate. Start to feel. Don't try to be conventional and unconventional, but discriminate. Start to feel into what it is that you're working for. But he goes on and says it's not enough to be intellectually discriminating. For the spiritual aspirant, however, it is not enough to exercise merely intellectual discrimination between the false and the true. So even after you get over the kick of conventionality and unconventionality and really start looking for what truth is, he says you got to go on. So intellectual discrimination is undoubtedly the basis for all further preparation. It yields its fruit only when newly perceived values are brought into relation with practical life. Now, here's Baba, back to Baba's old kick. And you've heard this 1,000 times as you've been through 3 volumes of the Discourses. And this is Baba constantly coming back to the thing and saying, look, it's not enough to have a great theory stuck up over here that you've pegged and that you've been pretty careful and discerning and discriminating about getting. All right, you don't sit around in great bull sessions and impress your various friends with what a magnificent theory this is. What you have to do is get out and live it. Now, you and I know that Baba is not just simply saying, all right, just don't sit around and theorize, but the reason that he is saying get out and live this is because it is only when the individual gets out and lives this material that he is feeling through that he can really start coming to grips with his identification with his own emotional pushes and pulls. This is where the real meat of the thing is then going to go. You have got, let us say, to get through all of these booby traps of conventional, unconventional, religious, irreligious, and start fighting for the thing which is the truth. And then once you begin to have some sort of a real idea, you can't sit around and keep it bottled up there. You can't sit off in a cave and meditate about it. You can't go to some idealistic farm project somewhere or another and raise turnips for 10 or 20 years in order to do this. You have to carry the thing into the middle of life. And the reason that it's important to carry it into the middle of life, where you are related with people and you're related to situations, is because this is where this new material that you have been uncovering is going to react on the inner you. And why does the inner you have to be reacted upon? Because the inner you, the part of yourself that has got to go ahead, as Baba pointed out originally in the Discourse, is completely fouled up with a lot of habit patterns of identifications with I am this, I'm not that, I've got to be this, I love that, and so on. And always and always, this is why the person has to get back into practical life. Because the discrimination that you are exercising, the ideas, the theories that you're developing, the things that you think may be of value, you've got to pour back into the activity of real life and see what the devil real life does to this. This is the only way that it can become active. Otherwise, it's an interesting idea, and it sits there passively. From the spiritual viewpoint, what matters is not theory, but practice. Sometimes even a wrong view, which is held with fervor. Now listen to this. Sometimes even a wrong view, which is held with fervor, may indirectly invite an experience that opens out the gates to the spiritual life. Well, what's he saying? Listen, many of you individuals have acutely keen intelligences. One of the first things that happens to you when you begin to find a philosophy of life, a creation that appeals to you, such as the Baba fantastic, such as many of the great sages have advanced. You become so deeply aware of the complexity with which life is put together that you think, my God, how do I know whether I'm taking the right step or not? And as a consequence, an individual will tie himself so much up in knots before he is willing to move that he doesn't move. Well, what is Baba saying here? He's not saying that the crowning important thing is to be right, to do the perfect thing as you do. No, he's saying move, get something into action, and then listen honestly as to what is happening, what environment is doing to that action. It's a lot more important to move and to learn from that motion than to sit around and endlessly tie oneself up in a knot. I'm not quite sure if I ought to do this. I'm not quite sure if I ought to do it quite that way. There's no move in relation to it. Now, he doesn't say it that forcefully. He does it much more delicately. He says, sometimes even a wrong view, which is held with fervor, may indirectly invite an experience that opens out the gates to the spiritual life. Even at the state of Shariat or Karmatanda, that's the stage where the individual is involved in conventional religion. Allegiance to religions is not infrequently a source of inspiration for many selfless and noble acts. For, while these dogmas or creeds are blindly accepted, they are often held with a fervor and enthusiasm which supply a dynamic element to the ideology which has been accepted by the person for the moment. Now, you may rise back in horror and say, but my gosh, that's the sort of thing that breeds dogmas and religious wars and so on. All right, sure, there's that danger too, but Baba is pointing out that the individual who is following a conventional religion and who is fired by it will act with a heart in it and with a force and a vigor that is terribly important. And if that individual has any degree of personal honesty, even though he may fall right over his own bootstraps, he will learn through it. Dogmas and creeds, as compared with barren views and doctrines, have the distinct advantage of being embraced not only by the intellect, but also by the heart. This is important. The sort of thing that we do here, for instance. What do? We read a discourse of Baba. We have words. We talk other words about it. Sometimes maybe there's some very humor that gets into it. Maybe sometimes a bit of sourness or bitterness there. But we're using words here. But then, what happens? What happens if anything real is happening? This carries back on over into the life of the individual, and the individual finds himself involved with life and deeply involved in life. So Baba is not putting philosophy out here. This is not the purpose of sitting and reading discourses and commenting on them to one another. As Bob mentioned earlier, in the life of an aspirant, the individual finds that his life begins to move, and then things begin to happen at a tremendous speed. And sometimes he wishes that he could actually slow it down when he gets terribly tired of the whole thing. So, being involved deeply within oneself in this thing. The only way that a discourse is of any interest and any importance and of any value is if it becomes integrally involved in the individual's life. I swear, 5 years from now, go back and reread these discourses and find out what a fantastic difference what has happened to you meanwhile means. Because the discourses themselves have got sort of little charges of TNT stuck in them. And first of all, you hear them as words. Well, one of the functions of a Baba is to direct guided missiles, you might say, into your own life. This is one of the ways that he contacts you, and believe me, it begins to happen. And you go back and you reread something of this sort, given by a live, vital, legitimate master, and 5 years later you realize how much has happened as a consequence. So, to go on, very often, however, the newly held beliefs, right, around we philosophize, we refine philosophy, are seen to lack the fervor and enthusiasm which characterize the allegiance to dogmas and creeds. If these newly held beliefs lack motive power, they belong only to the superficial aspect of life, and they hang loosely upon the person like an overcoat. Don't put out these things, you don't ham them because they make you feel pleasant or something of that sort. No, he says it's like a loosely hung overcoat. The mind has been emancipated from the domination of uncultured emotion, but this is often achieved by sacrificing the cooperation of the heart. So how, for the individual to achieve an intellectual emancipation, and carry his heart along with it, so that he goes ahead as a full, live, vital individual in life. Not in a little tea party sort of a fashion, not sort of mincing around, afraid that he might tiptoe into a little bit of mire somewhere or another, but really a live, vital, carrying new concepts into his daily life, pushing, willing to take on the consequences of poorly judged action, if that's what a particular one is, but moving. If these newly held beliefs lack motive power, they belong only to the superficial aspect of life, and they hang loosely upon the person like an overcoat. The mind has been emancipated from the domination of uncultured emotion, but this is often achieved by sacrificing the cooperation of the heart. I put this in rather an old-fashioned way, but believe me, this is terribly important. How does one get one's emotional energy and commitment? One's own challenge to commitment is involved here tremendously. If it isn't, by golly, either you're associated with a very superficial tradition, or else your relation to it is superficial. And then you better think of it. If the results of critical thought are to be spiritually fruitful, they must again invade and recapture the heart so as to enlist its cooperative functions. Get out, move, risk. In other words, the ideas which have been accepted after critical examination must again be released. Repeat it again here. Must again be released into active life if they are to yield their full benefit. In the process of practical life, they often undergo a healthy transformation. Now, listen to this. They often undergo a healthy transformation. What Baba is saying here again is another one of these key things in the ongoing of an individual. One of the things that you find out when you move ahead with somebody like a Baba in life is that much of what you originally thought you were absolutely dead certain of would be the characteristics of personal development or of a solution to a problem. When you carry it out into real life and you go ahead honestly and vigorously and not being afraid of every step, you end up finding out that what you learn and the solution as you learn it is rather vastly different from what you had originally envisaged. I've mentioned this a number of times, but it can't be mentioned enough times. There is no way in your life that you can pre-envisage, that you can pre-see the nature of a solution, of real wisdom in your own life, of a real working out of a situation. So often, a conscientious person falls in love with a Meher Baba and assumes that Meher Baba stands for this. I don't know how many thousands of people now I've run into who assume that Baba's all pro-vegetarian, for instance. Almost everybody I've run into, yes, falls in love with Baba. Says to me sometime or another in the first weeks that we get to know each other, well, of course, I've dropped off meat. Then I've got the rather embarrassing road to feel back with them to let them know without completely harpooning them that Baba doesn't stand for giving up meat. That's not necessarily it at all. There's so many misidentifications with what progress and spirituality are. I don't want to shock your ideas too completely as to maybe what a real good life-blooded legitimate avatar might be. But he's a lot different from what you imagined originally. And the spiritual life is a lot different than what you imagined. And this carries on. One's original ideas of what lousy, corrupt society stood for and what a properly lived life are, actually, if you go into it honestly, you may find that what you find is an astonishing blend of old and new ideas, and not a complete discarding. So what Baba is talking about here is an extraordinarily important thing that you bring into, you beat out of an original theory or an idea, something that is rather vastly different from what you had presupposed to yourself when you carry it into real life, honestly. Don't make preconceptions about these things. For heaven's sake, no. Don't get so stuffy and stogy about the other swing of the pendulum that you're in as bad a position as your ancestors were at the other side of the pendulum. This is not what we're here for. This is not what your potential is, quite frankly. You are what Baba has labeled new humanity. And that simply means you have the potential within yourself not to get stuck in the hopeless right and not to get stuck in the hopeless left, but to find out what real truth is. In the process of practical life, they, that is, one's ideas, one's theories, one's idealism, one's aspirations, often undergo a healthy transformation. Spiritual life is not to reinforce an Iron Maiden around you of cast iron of some form or another. No, it's complete freedom. And become more soundly interwoven with the very fabric of life. Not to get rid of life, not to destroy it, but to interweave it with the very fabric of life. This is where one carries one's spiritual ideals. Well, you may say, what's all that got to do with qualifications of the aspirant? Well, the first discourse is simply, you might say, the introduction to an aspirant. He simply carries the individual through the early stage of the necessary stage of conformance to religious rituals, ceremonies, conventionality, then points out that the individual begins to be dissatisfied with that. It is no longer satisfying to him, and so he starts to experiment with and to look towards unconventionality, while it flicks a quick caveat, a danger signal, a red flag into you and says, now look, strict unconventionality can be just as dangerous, just as binding as strict conventionality, and then he carries one on over into working for the truth and carrying that into daily life. And this is the beginning of the base in which an aspirant has to go ahead. Why is an aspirant important? Not because one ought to aspire to be an aspirant, but simply because any number of people are at a point where they have no choice but to become an aspirant, because it's in their blood. They're at that point. This is where they are. And so Bob offers a little insight. Now, in the next discourses, he will take up some of the actual qualifications, the attitudes, the way of trying to go about things to characterize an aspirant. There's some fairly rugged things that Baba brings up in the second one. They're not easy. Some of them are not very digestible. Some of the things that he was saying here are rather counter to current pop theory. So you may hear Baba saying some things here that will upset you. So I won't pretend that this evening will necessarily be an evening of just faith, sweetness, and light, because the path of the aspirant is a very real one. It's tough, it's sincere. There are very deep challenges that involve the individual is constantly precipitated into new ground where he's exploring. He's exploring within himself, and he's exploring apparently outside of himself. This is tough. And for an individual to do that, he has to win through to certain qualities that are not very, very easy and readily found. Baba labels this second discourse some divine qualities. And he goes on and says that the individual has to develop some divine qualities in order to be an aspirant. You don't develop the divine qualities when you get done being an aspirant. You've got to develop them in order to start moving. If the inner life of man is to be harmonious and enlightened, he has to develop and express many divine qualities while he is engaged in his daily duties. Every man is a rightful heir to the truth, but he who would inherit it must be spiritually prepared for it, and this spiritual preparation sometimes takes several lives of patience and persistent effort. One goes on for a good long time with just exactly such a type of effort. Therefore, one of the first requirements of the aspirant is that he should combine unfailing enthusiasm with unyielding patience. Just to be an aspirant, these are a couple of divine qualities that the individual has to develop just in order to get his toe started on the step, on the first step. So you say, God, I haven't even begun to start moving towards getting to be an aspirant. But listen, unfailing enthusiasm with unyielding patience. Unfailing enthusiasm. I mean, in this day of perpetual perpetual griping how many people can be an aspirant. And then yielding patience. I mean, how many individuals tackle a situation and in the course of a few minutes or a few days get utterly fed up with it and toss it over into the ash can. But this is necessary if a person is just going to be an aspirant, a sincere, productive aspirant, unfailing enthusiasm. How do you do it? Well, under the sun, that you look at some of the messes around you and some of the messes in your own life and have unfailing enthusiasm and unyielding patience. What you'd much rather do is get the husband or the wife or the child and give them a good swift kick and say, for heaven's sake. But he says unyielding patience. But most of all with yourself, and most of all with the environment that you're in. Once a man is determined to realize the truth, he finds that his path is beset with many difficulties, and there are very few who persist with steady courage till the very end. But this is what the path is about. The individual starts meeting internal developmental problems. And just as soon as he starts meeting problems, getting on the path, he almost automatically gets discouraged and says, why is it so tough? And this is what the path is about. So if an individual is honest and sincere in relation to wanting to move ahead, he can. He just has to say, okay, this is part and parcel of the game. This is part of the equation. And instead of sitting around and moping about it, or complaining about it, or saying, help, I want off, he can't tackle it that way. He's just got to have a dialogue with himself and say, all right, I've got to grow up. That's the only thing that you can say to yourself. You can't solve it. You can't say, why isn't that person better? Why isn't this situation handled better? Why don't I feel better at this point? And so on and so on and so on. No. You think, all right, I've got to grow up and say, all right, this is reality that I'm living with, or it's reality that I'm living toward. And this is the muck and the rumpus. But I've got to be mature enough to say, here it is, and I'll go on through it. Spiritual effort demands not only physical endurance and courage, actually really lays it on the line, you know. We just had unfailing enthusiasm with unyielding patience and persisting in the face of all difficulties, but it demands physical endurance. Right? So when you feel this absolutely dead beat, you still hold out. Sometimes when I listen to the stories of the Mandali, of the sort of training that Baba gave them during their lifetime in physical endurance, God, the hours and hours and hours and hours and hours on end that Baba would put them through the paces, exhausting paces, where for nights on end they would have 2 or 3 hours of sleep, maybe at most, or not even that amount undisturbed. Physical endurance. And you may say, well, but, all right, that was an unusual situation, a perfect master, an avatar, putting his close disciples to it. But look, this is the sort of thing that you and I get subjected to in our much less intensive business. I remember the first time something of the sort ever happened to me. I had briefly before been initiated on the mystic path, and the first thing that happened to me was that a situation blew up, and for something like 4 or 5 months, I had an absolute maximum of 5 hours sleep a night. Now, at the time, I certainly didn't associate this with a spiritual test, not the least bit. This was almost the first thing that happened to me after I'd been initiated as an aspirant. These things happen. One is put to a tremendous test in these things. Now, what does one do? Does one sit around, grumble, or look for all sorts of reasons as to why it's dead wrong? Sure, one ought to try to be as sensible as possible, but I just have to warn you that when an individual becomes an aspirant, he is put through the sausage grinder in situations where he has to have these qualifications that Bob is talking about in Chapter 2 on qualifications of the aspirant. Spiritual effort demands not only physical endurance, it happens this way, real physical endurance, and courage,
There are all sorts of frightening, scary things that come along. There are all sorts of human situations, human relatedness, human entanglement, human animosities. I don't know of anything under the sun in which more human animosity comes up than when individuals start looking deep within their own soul patterns. It's terribly important. It's terribly intense. They get upset with each other. And by golly, when a spiritual aspirant gets upset, there's all hell usually breaks loose. They're experts in the field. And so one has to have courage. If the first time that somebody comes up and backs you over the head for following the wrong way on the spiritual path, and you get all discouraged and mad and fussed up about the thing, you don't last long. You go off and you pout in your corner and you say, Baba, that's enough of it. I'm going out and commune with the birds and the bees and the bushes from now on. I mean, you become a nature lover, aspirant in such a case. I mean, you want it easier. These are the things that the individual butts up against inevitably. And what does he do against? The only thing that I can say to you is, he says, all right. More important than my comfort, more important than having things fairly easy, is